something incredible. Something you're going to find hard to believe. You have a connection to this planet. A very real connection. A connection in the form of a frequency. And you've had it your whole life. It's invisible to the human eye, but has been measured in science for more than 60 years. In fact, it's being measured right now. When the connection is broken, you suffer. It affects your physical health, your emotions, your ability to fight off disease, your sense of well-being. When the connection is restored, so are you. This is something you share with every human being on the planet. Something that's been there since the beginning of time. Something you need to know. Because your connection is being lost.
In the mid-'80s, fewer than 3% of all people in most of our countries were using cell phones. But you fast forward to today, when almost 100% of people are using cell phones.
By the time they're 19 or 20 years old, they will have used the phone for 10 years, and we have no idea what type of risk that's carrying.
We've immersed ourselves in an ocean of electromagnetic radiation. It's all around us now. Invisible, we can't see it, but we know it's there. Every time you lift up your mobile phone, you know it's there.
It's very, very hard to turn the clock back, or if not impossible to turn the clock back. But we need to be aware of the adverse health effects so that we have the choice of taking precaution against the exposures.
At present, the World Health Organization statements regarding this are that it is real.
We were not the only cancer cluster around a foam mast. There are many cancer clusters around foam masts.
Most of the cancers which will arrive haven't arrived yet. How could we have possibly thought putting microwaves to our brain was safe?
We just don't fully understand yet what we're doing.
We have an announcement finally on whether cell phones cause cancer.
How much has our environment changed because of electromagnetic fields?
Over the last 25 years, it's changed beyond recognition. Just beyond recognition. It's millions and millions of times in terms of electromagnetic energy.
The former National Radiological Protection Board, in one of their documents, said that they thought that the radiation environment, if you like to call it that, had increased many millions of times from what it was 50 years ago. Many millions of times.
It's an enormous change in environment on Earth, and it completely swamps all these natural signals, including the Schumann waves that we have evolved with.
An unknown scientist is about to make a discovery that should have changed everything. His name was Winifred Otto Schumann. On the day in question, he was teaching his students about the physics of electricity, how a sphere within a sphere can create electrical tension, and subsequently, a frequency. Schumann's class had struggled to understand the subject, so to make it easier, the professor instructed them to imagine the Earth as one sphere and the ionosphere as another. He then asked them to calculate the tension that would exist in between. Having no idea himself, Schumann also began to calculate. Eventually, he arrived at a frequency a frequency of approximately 10 Hz. As incredible as it seemed to Schumann, our planet had a pulse, a measurable frequency that surrounded life on Earth. Although the professor was proud of his find, he didn't see it as a hugely significant one, especially as it was only published in a small science journal, confined to the back pages, under the heading of Schumann resonance. It would take several years, and an incredible twist of fate, before the professor would begin to realise the true importance of Schumann resonance. That twist of fate had begun 30 years earlier, with another German scientist by the name of Hans Berger. Using an EEG machine he had built himself, Berger had made the first ever recording of electrical frequency transmitted by the human brain. It was initially suggested the wave be named after the man who'd discovered it, but Berger, being a modest man, elected for an alphabetical name and called it the alpha wave. Shortly after Professor Schumann's discovery, one of Hans Berger's colleagues, a man named Dr. Ankermüller, happened to stumble upon a bedraggled copy of a small scientific journal. The exact same small scientific journal that Professor Schumann's discovery had been published in several years before. He read the piece several times, shaking his head in disbelief. He realised instantly the magnitude of what was in front of him. The frequency of the alpha waves, recorded by Hans Berger, were almost identical to Schumann resonance, the frequency of the Earth. Dr. Ankermüller immediately contacted Schumann to convince him to investigate further. Schumann agreed and worked alongside one of his students to refine his discovery. They studied in detail how tension is discharged by lightning in the Earth ionosphere cavity. Eventually, they came up with an exact frequency. The pulse of the Earth, Schumann resonance, was exactly 7.83 Hz. The discovery was remarkable. Schumann resonance wasn't just similar to the alpha waves of the human brain, it was identical. The brain's frequency, which controlled our creativity, our performance, our stress, anxiety, and our immune system, had somehow tuned in to the frequency of the planet. The pulse of the Earth had become the pulse of life itself. The frequency of a wave is measured in Hertz. This refers to the number of oscillations the wave makes each second. Frequencies range from a billionth the size of an atom to the length of the universe itself. In theory, frequencies are infinite, so ultimately endless. If this was a coincidence, it was nature's most spectacular. If mankind has the ability to sense magnetic fields, the same ability as the bees, the birds, and the butterflies, does that also mean that we are as vulnerable as they are to man-made frequencies? Will changes in our environment affect us, as it's clearly affecting them?
Rolling. Okay, so how do you describe electrosensitivity?
Electrical sensitivity is when people start reacting, their body starts reacting to electromagnetic fields. Generally speaking, the electromagnetic fields that they'll be reacting to is wireless. So it'll be wireless communications, it'll be Wi-Fi, it'll be cordless phones, deck phones, mobile phones, masts. All of them emitting signals that our body has never experienced before. And when people start to become affected, when I became affected, the way that it starts to affect you is, generally speaking, it's your head first, and it will start giving you pains in your head. But I hate to use the word headache, because it's pains in your head that is unlike any other headache you've ever had before.
Most people's complaints are things like cardiac arrhythmia, insomnia, headache, visual disturbance, vertigo, different kinds of paresthesias or neurasthesias where they are feeling unusual sensations within their body. But really it can also affect endocrine function, thyroid function. Again, the list is really endless.
In my particular case, and this is not everybody's case, if I then don't get out of the environment, I start getting quite severe pains in my gut, and that will then mean it's too late, and I will then start bleeding internally.
I think that the symptoms are so diverse, and the associations that people make are very difficult to accept if you have no knowledge of this subject, which most physicians do not have. And that's no fault of their own. We're not trained to recognise this condition. It's very innovative, and our understanding of it is entirely embryonic at this stage. We're at the very first steps of unravelling and fully understanding this condition.
The whole issue of who funds scientific research is a thorny issue. I know many scientists like myself who, when they get a new study to read, the first thing they turn to is the back of the page where it says who funded it.
Is there, do you think, maybe a conflict of interest in the mobile phone industry funding research into the harm that it does?
Well, of course there is a potential conflict of interest, and that's why a programme of funding like this has to be carefully managed.
I've done a lot of work with the telecommunications industry because I happen to have I organise the communication workers representation in here, and so I've talked to these people for a long time. I think they would like to be objective, but they are driven, particularly in a market where they're fighting each other for market share by profit, and therefore they may fund research, but much like the pharmaceutical industry, you often find that they're hiring people who've already spoken on their side of the argument.
Scientists aren't pop stars. They don't earn a lot of money. They have houses to finance, they have families to look after. Who can blame them for recognising that if they find the wrong results, they're not going to get another job from that source at any rate?
There are psychological pressures, even in the absence of actual pressures, which may or may not be present in individual circumstances. There are clearly psychological pressures to conform and to please the organisation providing your funding.
You feel obliged.
You feel obliged, you feel obliged.
There are some really solid statistics showing that where there is an issue over electromagnetic field effects, that the studies funded by the utilities or by the power industry or the radio industry or by the mobile phone industry are funded by them, that the studies tend to be significantly negative, whereas the studies funded independently within universities and so on tend not to be so.
It's a challenging area in which to research. It's not easy to do studies of that sort, and because of the constraints of doing research in human subjects, you're not going to have perfect research studies. There are always going to be limitations.
Is this a real condition? Yes, absolutely it is. At present, the World Health Organization statements regarding this are that it is real and symptoms can be severe and disabling. Figures for electromagnetic hypersensitivity are around 2 to 3%. Those are people who've had their life extremely affected by this condition. But, as I've previously mentioned, on a cellular level, 100% of people are reacting. That means that the healthcare consequences of not taking this seriously and not recognising it are potentially huge. And the numbers of people that have mild or moderate electrical sensitivity are probably far higher than we estimate.
It leaves us with a tape recording of an experimental link-up between a standard telephone and a unique mobile handset. A dialing tone. And that's quite an achievement, because it's one thing to transmit a conversation, it's another to transmit accurate digital information. Now, an extension at the Research Institute in Chelmsford, which has perfected this technique. On the other end of this should be Liz Charnock.
With the advent of the mobile phone in the 1980s, came the need to build a network of antennas to support them. Since then, the telecom companies have erected over 5 million mobile phone masts around the world. But incredibly, prior to filling the air with microwave frequencies, they didn't conduct a single piece of research to ensure there wouldn't be any long-term health effects from such exposure. The grid was built without first making sure it was safe.
Thank you for your help.
So
it's pretty ugly, isn't it?
yeah, and it's constant as well. One thing you'll notice is it doesn't stop. It's 24/7. This is what's coming out of the mast. If you can see the mast, you're being exposed to it.
Right.
Frankly, even if you can't, you're being exposed to it if you're this distance away, because it'll pass through, concrete walls and things. It'll dampen it a bit, but not very much. If you're within 200-300 metres of the mast up there, this is what you're going to be exposed to 24/7.
When you can hear it, it changes everything.
It does.
Imagine if you could see it.
I mean, it'd be the equivalent of seeing a daily smog.
Yeah. With a constant smog of man-made frequencies surrounding our daily lives, and no testing as to its safety, is there any wonder people's bodies have started to react?
Well, it was almost 10 years ago, and I was in my 30s. No history of breast cancer in my family, and living a really healthy lifestyle. I'd been living next to a foam mast for many years, over 7 years by then.
How far was that from?
It was 100 metres from the house.
Right, so pretty close.
Yeah, and for years I'd been having symptoms which hadn't related to the foam mast, because I didn't know anything about the condition of electrosensitivity then. And I'd been having vertigo, sleep problems, headaches, sharp pains in my head. And I'd often visit the doctor only to be told it was either stress or a virus. And then, just out of the blue, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And it was the biggest shock of my life. And at first I thought, well, it's bad luck, it's just unlucky, it's me. And started to go through my treatment. And it was then I started bumping into neighbours in the hospital. And I only lived in a small village.
Right.
And started bumping into other young ladies as well, who were neighbours.
Young? How old?
Oh, well, I was the youngest in my 30s, but the others were in their 40s or early 50s.
Right, that's very young.
And that was 5 of us all diagnosed at once, within 6 months of each other, with breast cancer.
There were only 18 houses in the village surrounding the foam mast, so Eileen decided to conduct a survey to see if anybody else had suddenly started suffering ill health.
What came back really frightened us. Lots of people were reporting the same symptoms that I've been suffering with for years.
Vertigo.
Yeah, the headaches, the vertigo. But there was other young women in the village who were having fertility problems and precancer cervical cells. Other young ladies who'd had breast cancer benign lumps. And there were other conditions of cancer as well in the area. One of our neighbours, who was only 51, had developed motor neurone disease, and he unfortunately died. And so we unearthed a horrendous can of worms. We'd done a count of 77 people in the houses.
And out of 77 people, how many people were suffering biological effects?
The estimate was around 70%. People
70% of people
who'd had effects over the years with biological effects, sleep problems, skin rashes, benign lumps or cancer. It was it had a big impact on people in the village. I think this is a global massive problem. We found since then that we were not the only cancer cluster around a phone mast. There are many cancer clusters around phone masts, and we'd worked with a local scientist where we looked at other phone masts that have been in areas for a long time and conducted other surveys and found other cancer clusters as well.
With so many phones and masts, and a mobile phone industry worth trillions, you would hope that by now a strict governing body would have been installed, an iron-fisted regulator who ensures the telecoms industry errs on the side of caution, someone to set strict levels which protect the public, someone to ensure that what we're being exposed to is absolutely safe.
So what we've got is we've got a guidance standard which they've set, which has been adopted by most of the countries in Europe, and it's been something that the European Commission themselves recommend, including their expert body CENIR. But those guidelines are based on evidence that we know has a cause and effect for radio frequency radiation. So the only setting that exists at the moment for energy that's around the same frequency of mobile phone masts, mobile phones, DECT cordless phones, wireless communication devices that we're used to on a daily basis, is the one that we know works for microwave ovens, i.e. if you generate enough energy and localise it in a small enough area, you heat things. You heat tissue, you heat anything that has some level of water in it.
None of the current rules are anything to do with chronic health effects or cancer. None of them, not one of them. They're all set for heating effects and acute effects like prickling of the skin or your eyebrows going up or something like that, you know. None of them are for long-term health effects.
So saying that it's below 40, that it means nothing, it's meaningless?
It's meaningless. It is not intended to protect from long-term health effects.
What if I try and make a call? Let me try and make a call.
If you try and make a phone call, it'll be almost constant because it starts a proper sort of two-way high bandwidth transmission.
Okay, let's do that. Oh wow.
So as soon as it picks up, this is it trying to, and this is once it's on call mode, this is now what the phone's doing.
And that's waves going from my phone to the base station and then being transmitted from there.
And that's it's picked up.
That's horrible.
And that's basically what your phone's transmitting into your head all the time that you've got it operational and you're using it for phone.
It's hard to imagine a piece of technology which has accelerated into our lives quite like the mobile phone. 25 years ago, it was seen as little more than a gimmick. Today, 4 billion of us own one. And the average age of a child when they receive their first phone is just 8 years old. The way a mobile phone works is by sending and receiving microwave frequencies to and from the base station. So having a phone pressed against your head inevitably means your brain is being exposed to those waves. Does the brain react to this exposure? A recent American study shows it absolutely does. The work was carried out by Dr. Nora Valko. Dr. Valko and her team studied 47 healthy people for an entire year. Participants had a cell phone placed on their left and right ears. One was activated but muted, the other was turned off. Dr. Valko used brain imaging equipment to study how much glucose the brain would use during exposure.
So it's a very sensitive marker to indicate if there are changes in brain activity that may be driven by a given stimulus, which in this case was the cell phone.
When the brain is stimulated, it consumes glucose in the same way a car consumes fuel.
50-minute exposure to a cell phone was associated with increases in glucose consumption by the brain, which indicates that the brain was being activated by the radio frequencies from the cell phone. This right area of the brain that was very close to the antenna showed the largest increases in metabolism as compared when the telephones were off. even though the radio frequencies that are emitted from current cell phone technologies are very weak, they are able to activate the human brain to have an effect.
By using a muted cell phone, Dr. Valco's experiments showed that the human brain has a metabolic reaction to the presence of microwaves from a mobile phone. A metabolic reaction at levels well below the legal limit. Something many people claimed was impossible. And the reaction recorded by the doctor is secondary to an even greater concern: the way that those microwaves are actually absorbed by the brain. This has become known as SAR.
SAR is, well, first of all, it stands for specific absorption rate, and that's the measure of how much radio waves, or how much RF energy, in this case radio waves, is absorbed into the human body over a certain period of time within a certain volume. So it's a measure of the heating effect that a radio transmitter would have on your body, on the human body.
The SAR for every mobile phone is measured in this way, using an artificial head called a SAM phantom. This is filled with a glucose mixture which represents the brain. The probe measures the amount of microwave radiation that penetrates the SAM phantom skull and calculates a SAR rating based on how much energy is absorbed.
For the European Union, the limit is 2 watts per kilogram, over a 10-gram average of tissue. For America, it's 1.6 watts per kilogram, over a 1-gram average of tissue. So the limit for the USA is more stringent than for the European Union, but other countries around the world, such as Australia and New Zealand, use the European limit.
Some of the most popular phones on the market emit so much microwave radiation that their SAR rating is right on the edge of the limit. Every millimetre of skull helps protect the brain against the phone's microwave radiation, and therefore lowers the phone's SAR rating. Children get their first phone at the average age of 8 years old. An 8-year-old skull is considerably thinner than that of an adult, so you would hope that phones are tested against a skull which represents the thickness of that of a child.
The SAM head is an average shaped and sized human skull. The average of 10,000 people has been taken in terms of their head measurements, and this SAM phantom head has been created, which is an average human skull.
Obviously, the head of an average human being is considerably larger than that of an 8-year-old child. But when we investigate the company that makes the SAM phantom head, we discover that the news is even worse. The SAM phantom isn't just the average of 10,000 people. It's the average of 10,000 US Army personnel. And US Army personnel most certainly have a larger, bigger, thicker head than the average 8-year-old. It's pretty reasonable to assume that if most mobile phones were tested against the skull of an 8-year-old, they would fail. In 2011, the World Health Organization changed the danger rating of mobile phones, reclassing it as possibly carcinogenic to humans, based on an increased risk of contracting a geloma, the type of brain tumour associated with using a mobile phone. What was the catalyst for this abrupt change in status? There have been countless studies conducted into the possible health effects of mobile phones, some showing an effect, some showing no effect. But the most conclusive came from Leonard Hardell, He has overseen the largest and most comprehensive piece of research ever conducted, combining his own work with that of others from around the world. From the early 1990s, they have investigated the phone habits of more than 2,000 people from around the world. People with tumours such as astrocytoma and acoustic neuroma, the brain tumours associated most with mobile phone use due to their proximity to the ear. Their findings are shocking. They concluded that mobile phone use does increase the risk of a brain tumour. And they also discovered why earlier research showed no effect.
I think there's more evidence that it's carcinogenic than just possibly carcinogenic, but I can understand it in a way because most of the cancers which will arrive haven't arrived yet. I mean, people haven't been using cell phones for long enough for the true effect to become apparent.
As is the case with other carcinogens, it takes at least 10 years before you start to see an effect from the exposure. Because the mobile phone explosion didn't really take hold until the late 1990s, it's not surprising we are just starting to see the effects right now. So what are the telecoms industry doing to protect its users from contracting a brain tumour? A flick to the far reaches of their safety manuals suggests that they are more concerned about protecting themselves. At the back of almost every single phone's user guide are instructions on how far to keep your phone from your body. Instructions which, in the most part, are wholly unworkable. And what happens when the telecoms industry funds research into the harm that they are causing? And that research concludes that there is an effect. That the use of a mobile phone does play a role in the development of cancer. They tend to keep that research to themselves.
We just don't know what we're storing up with EMF. Because the effects are largely long-term, and we have, as you say, this ubiquitous exposure and ubiquitous reliance on these exposures. We just don't fully understand yet what we're doing.
But for years, the telecoms industry have defended their actions by asking the same question. As it turns out, they've been asking the wrong question. The answer is melatonin. Each day, our body loses about 500 million cells. And at night, that's when our body replaces those cells. Through a process called cell mitosis, the dividing of cells.
And what it's doing is it's mopping up what are called free radicals. These free radicals are really the spare electrons left over from the process of making the energy which we need to repair ourselves in the first place.
Each night, as our body repairs itself, millions of free radical cells are created as a byproduct of cell mitosis. These free radical cells attack healthy cells. It is universally agreed that the free radical cell is the main causal factor in most cancer. Our body's main defense against these free radicals is its most powerful antioxidant, melatonin.
It passes into the bloodstream, and its job is to act as a natural antioxidant, a natural anti-cancer agent. Melatonin is a very, very powerful anti-cancer agent.
What it does is it acts as what's called an oncostatic agent, that is, it protects you against cancer. It controls the sleep-wake cycle so that you get a good night's sleep when you've got proper melatonin. It's an anti-aging molecule. In other words, by mopping up those free radicals, it leaves your skin and complexion looking younger.
The genius of our body means it is able to counter the production of free radicals with the production of melatonin. We have created in ourselves a precise balance, a perfect system of defense. It has taken our body millions of years to perfect this technique. A technique created based on the surroundings we have evolved in. But over the last few decades, our surroundings have changed, and changed exponentially. To the naked eye, the world appears to be the same. But at a cellular level, it is the biggest change in environment life has ever encountered. It stands to reason that such a gargantuan change would inevitably upset such a delicate balance. And the consequences of our bodies not producing the right amount of melatonin could be disastrous. Scientists around the world now believe that free radicals could be the causal factor in every known disease, not just cancer.
In the beginning of the 1900s, childhood leukemia was a medical rarity. We've seen nothing but an increase in childhood leukemia ever since that point. It's going up every year by about 2%. And that applies to many other disorders as well. Autism, brain tumours, cancer. Cancer rates in the 1910s were probably half of what they are today. And many other diseases are being connected by studies, by scientific studies, with exposure to electromagnetic fields and radiations. Not just power lines, but also to radio fields and microwave fields. Because we've in the last 50 years, really, we've immersed ourselves in an ocean of electromagnetic radiation. It's all around us now. Invisible, we can't see it, but we know it's there. Every time you lift up your mobile phone, you know it's there.
It's very, very hard to turn the clock back, or if not impossible to turn the clock back. But we need to be aware of the adverse health effects so that we have the choice of taking precaution against the exposures, if that's what we wish to do, that's what we need to do.
What worries me are things that are actually happening now. Right. That we haven't paid enough attention to, perhaps. And one of the things that's happening is autism, or to give it its proper name, autistic spectrum disorders.
Do you think we're getting to a point in science where we almost don't have a control group to be able to test things like this, because almost everybody has a mobile phone, almost everybody has Wi-Fi, almost everybody is exposed to electromagnetic fields?
Yes, we are reaching a situation where so many people are exposed to electromagnetic fields from mobile phones and Wi-Fi that we no longer have a control population to look at the difference between people the health of people who are exposed versus the health of people who are not exposed. And if I can take an analogy, we did find out that smoking caused lung cancer. That was because some people did not smoke, and they were a control group. If everyone had smoked, we may never have found that smoking caused lung cancer. And everyone would have been dying of lung cancer, and it would have been regarded as a sort of natural disease without ever having a link with smoking. What's happening with mobile phone exposure is we are losing this population of people who are not exposed. Even the few people who don't own a mobile phone are surrounded by the radiation from the mobile phone when they go shopping, when they go on a train, wherever they go.
It's not just the canary down the mine like myself. Eventually, if you simply increase the electromagnetic fields in the atmosphere, which we're doing, and we're now got a million times more electromagnetic fields, microwaves in the environment than we had 30 years ago, eventually it'll start to affect you.
It's very, very hard to say where we might be in 15 years' time, but I would very much hope that in a few years' time we do recognise just how much these ill health effects are actually costing society. And then we might wake up and look at the causes and realise we have to do something about the causes.
We are a brilliant, yet complex organism. The way that our body functions isn't by chance, nor is it something which has happened overnight. Like every other creature on this planet, we have adapted into the environment we exist in. An environment which, since the beginning of time, has had a delicate balance of fields and resonances. These phenomena don't just surround us, they make us what we are. The cells of our body communicate with each other using light frequencies. Our DNA uses electromagnetic frequencies to reproduce itself. At the core of everything are protons and electrons, positive and negative, making all life magnetic. We are, as all life is, equipped with cryptochrome cells, which allows us to sense those fields in ways we barely understand. We are beings of frequency, electricity, light, and magnetism. And to become this way has taken millions of years, a process which started with the very first cell. Although we have embraced the wireless technology and accepted it into our everyday lives, at a cellular level, our bodies haven't. The frequencies that now surround us are as alien to our cells as they would be to our eyes, if only we could see them. Our children are being born into a world that their bodies simply cannot understand. Where will all this lead? As this film is being made, 4G technology is being rolled out around the world. To accommodate this, the ceiling levels are being increased. Wi-Fi is in almost every single home, school and business, surrounding us constantly. Deck phone technology is the norm in almost every single household. At a time when the industries responsible should be displaying caution, they are displaying a reckless disregard for our long-term health. Money talks, and they are about as likely to develop a conscience as the tobacco industries did. If there's going to be a change, it's not going to come from them. It's going to have to come from us. We just need to open our eyes and see the problem.